Okay, let's see what's going on over at.
Okay. In in theory, we're back again. How the hell?
Yeah, you
It's
better.
it's
Oh,
it's
it's read here.
it's
There we
fiber optic.
go.
How the hell is a fiber optic cable drop? It's underground. Anyway,
Maybe a muskrat or something bit into it,
could very well be. In any case, apologies,
or
everyone.
it's the evil spirits of Ken Ham.
Could very well be. Hey, howdy, Tao. All right, now we got the good screen. We're back. Let us
Try again. So at the top of the hour at 5:19.
get top of the hour. The last thing where we left off, I believe, was evolution relating to free will.
Yeah, that was an intriguing subject matter. It's a can of worms. We don't entirely know why we're conscious, and therefore we don't entirely know how it is we have will at all. A lot about the brain is consciously. If you decide to move your finger, boop, 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 your brain will kind of figure out what it needs to do, and then you make a decision seemingly after it's already worked out what you're about to do. So an awful lot of the things that we perceive as choices aren't necessarily choices. They're just what we retroactively decide are choices. And we know the brain tricks our memory. It provides us a thing that pops up in my own life, and I think it happens for an awful lot of other people, is how many times I woke up by an alarm, thinking that the alarm was already running. In a way, the brain kind of is getting sensory input, and then it retroactively generates false memory of the event in question. So a lot of what we perceive of as free will and intention are a bit more complicated than that. Now, it throws everything into a cocked hat when we deal with legal responsibilities, to where if we're just an automaton, we be held responsible for it? And you can find an awful lot of burrowing into the ground with Jerry Coyne on this subject matter, where he seems that there is not an intrinsic problem, but there's something about it that feels odd if we assume that we're merely a machine rather than something that is aware of its machineness and can in fact make choices on matters. I mentioned a nice writer is probably not terribly available nowadays because I don't think it's stuff online, but it's in an old book, Nora Tranders, who is a Danish science writer, book on Benjamin LeVay and others. Uh, and he would differentiate between me. The me is all the components that go around in our brain, but not all of which, most of which are not conscious. The I is the self-awareness part. The brain creates a series of cocoons for our self-awareness that give us an illusion of being in charge of stuff. You know this automatically. How many people, when they drive to work, don't consciously think a great deal about what they're doing? It all becomes automatic when you're riding a bicycle or any of these other things. And so you can do very complex activity without necessarily being conscious of them. When you suddenly bump into other things or take your mind off the road and suddenly you're driving into walls, it's because you're no longer having a proper connect between the I and the me. Neurobiology is still pretty new on a lot of this stuff, and I've been kind of keeping track of the bits and pieces of it. Some of the studies, hard to tell the time frames. It's like a half a millisecond difference between a perception and what the brain is doing. And so we can get to run over this time because is it some a feed from your end or power failures or some such thing? And I was the one worried about power failure here.
Gotta be, gotta be. We are showing up as resumed. We've had some storms in the area, but theoretically, fiber optics is supposed to be immune to that sort of thing. Just so we don't irritate the crap out of everyone, why don't we kill it and reschedule for tomorrow night? What do you think, RJ?
Let me.
Yes. Definitely not going well this evening.
Well, we'll show our college try pluck and improvise. So long as we can, theoretically, you can string together to put actually getting as a final posted version. Is that right?
This is yeah, and I looking at the records, I've seen what's going on twice. We're not losing the internet connection. For some reason, we're losing DNS. Anyway, what do you think
Bum bum bum.
to to not annoy everyone with the constant drops here tonight? Do you want to reschedule for tomorrow? What do you all think, everyone?
I can do that. Yeah, if you feel it would be a better opportunity on there.
I'm just thinking we
can wing it just for the time being because we got people here, but then we can do another official one tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do an official one tomorrow. I can't really guarantee the connection's going to stay up. So
yeah. Well, we can fuddle along here at least as well we can because I can see the screen and we got sound popping around in there. So at the very least, we can kill some time here with some interesting little conversation matters.
Indeed, I will. Let's see. Let us move on, and let's see what other interesting questions we had in the last week. Oh! Here's a fun one. Here's a fun little one. Did you know, RJ? Were you aware that the whale's hip bones are not vestigial?
And did they know to actually read more of the science data first before they decided to go off that little high dive? Oh, my. Yeah, that one is a really common confusion that spreads across both intelligent design and young Earth creationist apologetics and old Earth creationist. It's the confusion of vestigial with functionless. Vestigial thing, particularly in the modern context, as in like the last 50 years, is that it's not you doing the function it was originally doing. That's what vestigial means. And so the appendix is a fine example of a vestigial system. It does stuff. It's taken on actually new activities. It's become like a bacterial sink inside of our gut. That's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get rid of an appendix. But it doesn't mean that it's doing what it was originally in organisms that had that. And the legs are exactly that thing. We know that the earliest whales, we found more and more fossils of them, have full-blown legs with the flippery thing. And gradually, the interesting thing about why whales go the direction they do is how they swim. All the reptiles are side-to-side swimmers. They're snake-like, crocodile-like. They swing laterally, whereas mammals flex the other direction. They flex up and down. That very, very naturally for mammals in swimming. And as a consequence, it produces a different dynamic. End up producing critters that look like a form where the front flippers become the propulsive mechanism, and the ones behind are no longer paying so much attention because the fluke on the tail is providing the propulsive force much better than any legs can. And so the selection pressure was on getting rid of that, or rather minimizing it. And you still find the legs going on in the whale embryology. Occasionally, the genes will switch on, and you'll find a whale with little teeny legs sticking out of its sides down there. And some whales still, and the old Basilosaurus still had little tiny vestigial legs that presumably were involved in copulation, they figure, and presumably body rubbing and making all the things to make little baby whales. But it's not doing the function it was before, which was walking around on land or even swimming water-like format or a sea lion context where you still had the four limbs, or for that matter, plesiosaurs over on the reptile side were ones that had fore and aft flippers that we're using for propulsion, but they had a relatively thin tail and their body dynamics were different because they're on the diapsid line of things. So when you understand the biology and the genealogy and the lineage of how you produce one organism as opposed to another. The vestigial things make sense, finding leftovers of things that originally came from a different dynamic. And you'd have to explain, I mentioned before we actually did the show, there's a spectacular case of vestigial in whales, and that's the fact that all of the toothless whales still have tooth enamel genes buried in their genomes. Every single, and all, in fact, all mammals have tooth enamel genes, even ones that have no teeth, ones that have teeth but no tooth enamel, they still have tooth enamel. Why? Because they've been clunked around as a pseudogene, and they haven't had a chance to, the editing out system hasn't, just by luck of the draw, components, because they've happened relatively recently. It takes an awful long time to deactivate or edit out, which is why you get a whole bunch of stuff knocking around like cobwebs in the attic. And a designer could easily lean genome where you only have the stuff you need, but no, that's not the way living systems run. So I hope that answers that question rather well on the issue of the things. We got a lot more fossils on whales. It's not only, you can see not only it's not a vestigial feature, but it's an evolving feature. The fact that the whales start out with their nostrils in the front of the snout like their land ancestors, and it's only over time that the snout moves backwards to the blowhole that we're familiar with. So there's just evolution up the yin-yang on these things, and there's so much more data available that please don't retread some stupid Jonathan Sarfati thing off of AIG. Try looking up the original material one of these days.
Indeed. All right. Well, since you mentioned the genome, I think before we started, I mentioned another one that I've heard way too many times. Back to DNA. It's all information, you know, like a book. That's what it is. And the question was, and I'm sure many of us have heard this, where does the new information in DNA come from? This new information. Any idea where that might come from, RJ?
Oh, gee whiz. Well, that's your natural mutation shtick. And gene duplications are one of the most spectacular cases. You could have whole chromosome duplications. And the cliche reply from creationists is, well, it's duplicated, so it's not new information. It doesn't need that, because it now can turn into new information. And there's a whole vast amount of technical literature. It's hard to find a major biological system that doesn't to something where a gene that started out doing one function has gotten duplicated and takes on a new function. So it still does the old function plus the new function over time. Some of these things are relatively minor details. The obvious case of antifreeze proteins in fish, that's a gene duplication, where a single point mutation has turned it into a thing that takes on a new property that it didn't have before. Most of the big league new air quotes information things come about because a little mutation here and a little mutation here and a new triggering. Another way that generates new air quotes information is not having a new gene, but changing the pacing of its regulation, so that the same genetic information is turned on or off at a different rate or in a different time. And bingo, you have an alteration in biological function. You have a change in the way the bones are shaped. You have all sorts of things. And this gets into issues of heterochrony and alike, which involves the pacing of things. And there's, again, a huge technical literature on this. They've been studying this stuff even before they figured out how DNA worked. And Stephen Jay Gould's gone off on it a lot in his various writings over the years. And this stuff doesn't get paid much attention to. Steve Meyer in particular is very fond of arguing, where did all the genetic information come from for the Cambrian explosion? Ask him, what information does he think is new to the Cambrian? Because the homeobox genes and the various subassemblies of these things are all stuff that is doing stuff before you actually get to the Cambrian explosion. What you're seeing in there is a set of new combinations, and that changing in developmental timing issue, allochrony and heterochrony and all of that, are likely to be the factors involved. We know that fruit flies and us all use homeobox genes to generate body plan. Now, we look really different from fruit flies. Why? Because the splits as to how those homeobox genes have been duplicated and how many pairs and sets and what mutations have occurred in the duplications have had 500 million years of wind-up before you get into the case where you've got the Cambrian explosion, and then from that point on. Remember, when we're looking at DNA, we're looking at the living organism version. If you don't believe in common descent, you have to ask, is anything that existed in the past physically related to anything now? But an evolutionist isn't hampered by that little conceptual box. It's also reached the stage where, because they can see the potential gene duplication and functionality bit, paleogenomics has already begun retro-engineering the ancestral version from which the two variations have come about. And so you can then test out literally the ancestral version of molecular systems and even developmental systems now. They're getting into the cis-regulatory level, where you can see what the effects of things are. It's performing an intermediate function in the early stage and then developing into specialized functions over time. None of that material ever gets covered in the anti-evolution literature, by the way, which I make a point of noticing, because I notice what sources they cite and which ones they don't. There's that question a bit there. It's a big subject to go into there. You can easily dive into gene after gene after gene, but then if you look up homeobox genes in particular, just the gene duplications at those body plan phyla level things have a vast amount of connections as to why we look so different from fruit flies.
Alrighty, let's see what else we have here.
Yeah, who's going to, still must be questions that can stump me. I don't know everything. I know that may be shocking.
That's crazy talk, RJ.
I know, crazy talk. But there are vast amounts of areas that I have not necessarily studied, or areas where the study hasn't yet been done. It's hard to do. There are things that people, the metapleural glands in ants, for example. My God, there's 20,000 species of ants, and there's virtually no information on what the hell the metapleural glands do. They've identified them in the organism, but they haven't actually investigated any of that stuff. So there's like terra incognito. I found out about that when I was doing the slam dunk. Ooh, how did plant life evolve versus insects, reptiles, mammals, etc.? Oh, that's a fairly sure the context in which you're talking about that. Except in the sense that plants are a really distant cousin to the kind of metazoan bits that we get with insects and reptiles. Plants have some elements of that homeobox system, as I recall, and there's a para-HOX system and a few other things. And there's a lot of other systems that are common to both of us. That's how you can give some idea. Luca and universal common ancestors and universal metazoan ancestors and first bilaterians and all that. But plants split off a long time ago, and they come from a variety of bacterial forms, and they've had a different set of symbiotic systems. A big driver, of course, with plants is their photosynthesis, which they got from the cyanobacteria. So all plants and animals have mitochondrial endosymbionts, which shows that's occurring way before the split between plants and animals. But only the plants have those chloroplasts endosymbionts, which means that that's occurring in their lineage independently, and we don't have any counterparts of that over on the vertebrate side. A fact that are coming from things that are living initially in the sea, as virtually everything is, but they really go into high gear when they start proliferating onto the land. And once they don't have any problem with oxygen levels because they don't use it as a fuel. They use carbon dioxide as a fuel. And they spew out oxygen to the great benefit of things like us that breathe oxygen. But even this, at some of the cellular tissue levels, at some of the cell replication levels, some of the deep ATP and other things, I think there are an awful lot of connections that you can find at that deep level between plants and animals. In some respects, there's way more difference between metazoans in general, animals in general, and plants, between versions of animals, so that there's way more in common in terms of how neuro systems function and the like between us and an insect, even though we look really different. Some of the visual sensation systems and some of the signal processing things are convergent between the two. And then closer along between birds and mammals, the two warm-blooded cohorts that have developed in the last 150 million years, that there's so many convergent similarities between those two. The fact that our hair and the feathers of birds are keratin systems that are devised on the skin placodes by using of BMP and the sonic hedgehog and all that. Same genes are involved, but they've taken their own different routes because of that varying lineage. Needless to say, a hell of a lot of science information going on in there. And you do find a whole host of genes that don't play a role over in the animal side that have developed their own little specialized roles. Plants in particular do polyploidy, where there's whole genome duplications, chromosome duplications just are very rampant among plants. And it's something that in invertebrates just causes us to glitch up really bad. So we're very boring in that respect. And then, of course, you got your fungi, and they're very complicated systems that are as disparate from plants as plants are from us. Shorthand answer there, Andy, on where that is. And if you wanted to follow up, just fire it away.
Ooh, what over here?
Ooh, breathing. Ooh, that came along. Yeah, that's a neat one. Up to which level do organisms get along without gills or lungs, and at which time does that put the first precursors to modern ones? Oh, yeah, yeah. That's an intriguing one because the short form is that lungs develop as an independent system along with gills in fish. There's one, we're talking vestigial organs again. The swim bladder in teleost fish is a distant modified descendant of the proto-lung systems that are occurring in these fish lines, some of which then branch off to ones that can find a way to gulp air along with lungs. The earliest amphibians, of course, still had gills along with the lung system. So the creationists who back in the 60s and 70s were trying to argue that evolution is falsified because no one can prove that lungs evolved from gills. No, they didn't evolve from gills. They developed from a completely different system that's a gas exchange system. And I think they're just starting to work out some of the biology of what the proto-lung system was doing before it was doing gas exchanges. But remember, there's oxygen in the environment. The vertebrates in general are making use of oxygen. And when you have things where you have fluctuations, there's a selective pressure if you have a system that develops an alternate way of doing something that's useful to you. And over time, then, you've got the fact that the vertebrates are developing the tetrapods that eventually go out on the land. A lot of the stuff they're developing are before they ever go out on the land. And it's only later on that they start colonizing as the oxygen levels have risen in that in the Devonian to where they can start playing around in it. And then the big munchy bugs that they can go after up on the with the higher oxygen levels that was occurring during the Carboniferous. But yeah, so the short form is if you Google around about swim bladders, you can find some of the technical literature that would lead you back to that fascinating subject of where lungs developed in that Rhipidisterian fish line that led to our lungs, as opposed to the lung form that turned into the swim bladders on teleosts. Teleosts are fairly a recent development too. They're full-blown system. They're coming along about the same time as angiosperm flowering plants are. A lot of that is coming out in the Cretaceous, and so there's a huge explosion of teleost fishes that have replaced a lot of the earlier versions that have just remnant groups. I think sturgeon are a really old fish line, and of course sharks. The cartilaginous fish go back really far and have been enormously diverse. We're seeing a very trimmed down all the various sharks. My favorite one is that one that looks like it's got a ironing board studded with teeth on its dorsal area, and presumably it's some sort of mating thing or sexual display thing. It's a really weird looking critter, and some of the sharks are absolutely oddball. Well, I hope that answered a little bit on that one. It's an ongoing work because now they're reaching the stages now where they can start ferreting out the genes that are involved in a lot of that lung evolution system that they couldn't have. Homeobox genes were only discovered 20 years ago. So you've got an awful lot of ongoing work. The anti-evolutionists aren't doing any of that ongoing work and don't pay a hell of a lot of attention to the ones that are. So they're way kind of behind the curve on that one. Another question?
All right. Well, we'll keep an eye on the chats. Nothing on Twitter. All right. We can hop down the list here. Oh, here's one that's just going to frighten you. I'll bet you don't have an answer for this one, RJ.
I quiver in fear.
And I know you've never, nor have any of our viewers ever heard this one before. Did you know, RJ, that polonium halos actually prove a young Earth? Are you aware of that?
Oh, golly, John, that's a real rip snorter. And the guy that's involved with that is Robert Gentry, who's still knocking around. He looks a little bit like Kent Hovind without the beard, by the way, if you've ever seen him. And in the 1960s, by the way, all of his stuff originally was published in Science magazine in the 1960s. So he has that lay to claim that this is stuff in actual science journals. And it was an intriguing subject because polonium is a little short-lived radionucleotide that occurs in a lot of decay change from lead into from uranium into lead. And what he was finding were these little rings that when you get the radiation that comes out of atoms, they produce like little ripple effects that produce rings around them in the rocks. It colors the material. And what he was arguing is that there are these polonium halos without any of the precursors. It's materializing out of nowhere without the rings of the precursor series. And he was going, ta-da, this is the fingerprint of God. This was when God made the polonium 6,000 years ago. And at that point, Science magazine began to be a little more suspicious of what was going on. Well, if you investigate this issue, there's a really important feature. They're always found in unusual circumstances, like in mica particularly. And you have to therefore go into the issue of how mica forms and how things crystallize. And one of the dead giveaways that of a clue as to what's going on here is the fact that polonium chain that comes from radon. And radon is an extremely permeable radioactive gas. And what looks like's happening in this is that as the uranium decay chain goes, if it's in an environment in which that it's leaking into other metals because it's hot temperature and all that down in the earth, that radon stage, which it's got to, the radon is going to leak off unlived. And so it can go leaking and squishing into other areas and being intruded into this. So now you have the radon there that's then decaying into the daughter products, the precursor, because it's moved into a different location. So it all relates to the formation of mica. And there's actually been some technical work that's experimented on how that migration occurs and the like. Well, Gentry's having none of that. He doesn't allow for that, insisting to this day. Oh, and by the way, he even worked out that the Earth is the center of the universe, or at least our solar system is, that we're on the throne of God, and he figures out how far away all that is. He lives in a fascinating little worldview. But yeah, polonium halos are also an interesting one to throw at intelligent design people because the ideas say that we just want to have the science evidence presented to teach the controversy. So if I come in with some little article from a science magazine that can be fitted into the creationist or intelligent design framework, that's okay. Well, can't you do that with polonium halos? Come in with those papers from Science magazine and go wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the Earth is really young. Don't they get to play too? Yeah, but then you got to look at the context of it. And just as Gentry's stuff falls apart when you look at it closely, so too the intelligent design spin on the Cambrian or origin of eyeballs or anything else start falling apart. There was a thing here. It's a little too Grisfelis. Hi, RJ, finally got here. Oh, Jade West. Hello, Jade. We had a wonderful time on there. I loved your analysis on that. I hope you can send me, get scanned on that stuff. We can exchange emails and stuff at my tip website. That was absolutely wonderful because Silvestro, I'd really love to see all of his references and text on it. But that one bit you gave on the dinosaurs, that was grist for my mill because there I had him pinned down to an error. I don't know how many of people following were following the discussion that Jade had on McCrae's show, and she had actually bought this idiot's book. The days when I had more money, I probably would have wanted to have that as well. But she went through and looked at all the analysis, and we went through page by page by page and page on that. And then I asked some occasional questions. I had known about the guy already, but I didn't have him in my bibliography because I didn't have access to his book directly. But thanks to you, Jade, I was able to view his book vicariously. So I was able to pull up from the website. They had the table of contents and a few other things, and so I was able to follow along there. So it's now in a state where I can make criticism of it directly because of the information that I got of you. Oh yeah, there we go. Oh, absolutely. Any information at all. Matter of fact, it's an open access bit because I don't hide my identity or anything else. So anybody that wants to contact me, here is coming my dreaded email. And anybody who wants to try to spam me had better beware that I am not easily spammed. Of course, also at the hashtag tip website, but for any comments and stuff, you www.tortucan.wordpress.com. I answer all and bandy back and forth all on that. But yeah, it looks like you have a spectacular array of background information, Jade. That that could be a stumper. As Satan just put up here. Do you think arsenic could be a viable substitute for phosphorus as an essential element for life forms? I don't know on that one. I know arsenic plays a peculiar role, and there was a flap recently over some people who thought they had found an arsenic metabolizing organism, but there turned out to be contamination problems, so it basically turned into a oops kind of a thing. About whether or not that can do, and this whole goes into the whole issue of how of the CHOMPS environment, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus system that we make use of, is because that's the only system that'll work. Must we use DNA? Must we use nucleic acids? Must we use DNA as double helix rather than triple? In other words, are there any other alternative ways of doing life we have? My suspicion is why we use the things we do. It's kludgy and clumsy, but that's basically the system that works. And whatever experiments that were done in the prebiotic, pre-RNA phase of things, and before cell membranes formed and replicators generated and all of that, there was an awful lot of pre-Darwinian selection going on as whatever was metabolizing up, down, and yin yang. Some things were more reliable and fertile than others, and that's the system that we now end up seeing. So if I were to place a bet on how arsenic might work, unlikely. I don't know about the physics of a detail. Another area, silicon instead of carbon. And the problem with silicon is that it forms bonds with oxygen, water too easily, and it forms silicates. And that's one of the advantages of the carbon bond, is they're snug, but not unbreakable. It's got to be something that you can ease apart, but not too easily. And once those damn silicates form, analysts said that if you had a silicon-based organism, Mars would be too wet for it. Another one is, can ammonia function as a moderator like water? And there's some theoretical work that suggests that under high pressure, at least, ammonia could function like water. But whether or not the rest of the metabolisms can work under that, it's hard to say. If we had other life systems going on, that would be fabulous. If we find something on Europa and discover that it's an arsenic-based ammonia system, you'll get Nobel Prizes up the yin-yang on that one, and the creationists will have to start oiling the goalposts to move. But I'm not holding my breath on other than DNA. Satan. Oh, she's got several accounts. Yeah, well, that's I enjoyed listening to you. It sounds like you have done a spectacular amount of research material, and that's the things that I absolutely adore. Having that older primary source information, and some of these things that have never gotten online. Unless you physically bought the book, you'd have no way of knowing much about it other than just the stuff that you can glean off of the website. And some of the stuff even that was generated on websites disappears over time. They lose track of stuff. So unless you do a hard copy, boop, it's lost. There's a wonderful advantage to seeing a broad picture of what's going on in any subculture. And even though Silvestro is playing the role of incredibly superficial copyist, in some cases you can even kind of ferret out where he's copying his stuff from. to pick Silvestro's brain because here he is riffing off of David Norman's Dinosaur Encyclopedia. Is it because he read the Dinosaur Encyclopedia directly? A quote mine from somewhere else secondarily. That would be the interesting scholarly questions to ask about the guy, and it wouldn't surprise me if he got his stuff secondarily. Anybody who footnotes that loosely, as from what I gathered from your analysis, Jade, is probably not a read the primary source directly guy. Yeah, I love data too, and you never can tell what you're looking for. The one tool that I found most useful work is to Google for the title of things, for full up. Sometimes I have to do subject matter material, but if I'm looking at a technical paper, and if it's cited directly, and usually your creationists are really, really anal retentive careful in typing the text out accurately the best they could. A typo might leak in, but not all that often. If you Google the title, author, or some of these other matters, or go by conventional links, you can then glean on Google searches who has cited it subsequently. I was just doing that resources there because you find out directly some of the subsequent work in the area. Unfortunately, we're in a less fun area when it comes to the citation system. Science, old days, up until about 2012 or 13, when they changed their website, you used to be able to pull up an abstract free, but you would see everybody within the citation system that cited it since anymore at their website. You don't get that on the abstract. Whereas at Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that still happens. So you can look up an old PNAS paper and you'll see a whole bunch of high wire citations off of the paper, and you can go click link and so forth and so on. So from a scholar's point of view, especially an impoverished one like me, who doesn't have scratch to buy stuff, that's really an important tool. And I found that some of the material using the title searching in Google perform that same function. Information out there. Oh yeah, the Fino is quite right about some of the things from the Latin, and also some of the stuff comes from German. The KT extinction was called the KT extinction is because the Germans did a lot of geology works and they spell Cretaceous with a K. Why it popped up that way. That now, as you are well aware, it's the Cretaceous Paleogene. Sometimes you find the Tertiary. That's another thing. Of some of the older material that you put up from Silvestro was a perfectly fine example of not only do we not know the provenance of it, because he never bothered to put that in his text, but it's really old. And it's just hilariously old. The tendency of superficial scholars to copy material without its checking the provenance is a systemic difficulty with anti-evolutionism. And to the extent we don't play that game, the extent that we go after primary sources, we're ahead of them right on definition. Yes, I can agree there, Jade, on the retiree income thing. I'd love to have. I've had to scrape by. The only reason I was able to do Slam Dunk the way I did is because Glenn Branch at the NCSE bought a Denton book for me that he shipped to me from Amazon. I then took all my notes and material off of it and then shipped the book back to NCSE for their library. The thing is that not enough people have gone after Denton. Methods point of view, he's a sitting duck. He is a beautiful target, and those who get my Slam Dunk book will see me pull him apart on quite a lot of subject matter in there, and he falls apart at the source methods level. At the top of their food chain on the scholarly land, just as the Snelling would be at the top of their food chain over in creationism. Pulling them down is mean you're pulling down their top guns. Pause for breath once in a while, sigh.
Okay, it's Andy says his phone was dying there, so he has checked out. I copied down while we were going. He had actually a follow up on his question about plant versus animal, evolution. So
Oh,
we'll
good. Swing that by me.
it is let's see. I wonder if Andy's still here to hear it. All right. Well, he can hear it in the replay, I guess. Okay. Here's what he asked as a follow up. He says, yeah, here it is. He says, I guess I was more asking, do plants evolve in a similar or dissimilar manner to insect and others? Naturally, life will do what it takes to survive, but the process, how does the process differ? In other words, once you have the separation of plants and animals, does the process of evolution uh, take different steps and paths? I got it. I see what he means by that question. Like you
Yeah,
mentioned you
yeah.
mentioned earlier,
Um,
polyploidy kills us, but it's just fine with plants.
yeah, we're relatively boring in an awful lot of ways. Plants, biologically staggeringly diverse. They deal with mutations and parasites in things. They communicate with one another in ways that are very unusual through pheromones and through a lot of other sensory connective systems. It's not quite like a nervous system. They don't have a nervous system per se, but they are able to react in very complex ways. Somebody have even joked, in effect, that the chemicals that grass give off when you mow the lawn that smells so wonderful is basically plant screaming. So yeah,
that
you may
spoiled
never
it for
think of your
me.
lawn mowing again in quite the same way. And the thing that is most fascinating, if you've ever seen time-lapse pictures of plants, you go, yipes. If they moved that fast, we would be scared shitless of them. There's a relentlessness to plants. There is such an unforgiving, and some of the plants, in fact, there are ones that parasitize other plants, ones that will inveigle in and simply crush and totally parasitize the poor little plant, so that now it's like a husk down inside the new plant. And it's nature red in tooth and claw applies to plants too. They just do it in a slightly different way. And so, as I said, biologically, although the deep level genetic systems are very similar between the two, and our mitochondria have a common ancestry, how it plays out very differently. And plants are able to adapt. The very fact that they're running off of a CO2 system rather than an oxygen system, the deep core of their system, they're giving off as a waste product what the animals require to live. You've got a very different dynamic going on. Once in a while you find examples, and it's usually at the deep chemistry level, deep biology level, of where systems that we are still using in the vertebrate side of things actually have their counterparts over in plant land, but different dynamics on there. It's a billion years since we've had a split with the plants. Easy. C'est la vie. It's bye-bye. The plants as we know them, the non-aquatic descendants of them, are really in the last like 400 million years. So in many respects, plants are getting their land legs going after vertebrates. Insects go up on the land first. And of course, before them, the bacteria, which are the real hardy ones. They're also fiddling around in that little bunch. So yeah, that's a really good question as to how much of the various kingdoms of life, architectural systems, and then how much is the natural variation part. And in every one of the kingdoms, you've got just a staggering amount of variations, so that when you see all of that in chronological order, see any divine plan or any beeline to human beings, which is kind of the way that anti-evolutionists like to think of it, that the purpose of all of that is just to produce Philip Johnson. Hello?
Hello. All right. Oh yeah. Still get Fino's last comment. Organism with both traits would be horrific. You mean like Groot?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and indeed, that's where it comes in fun when you do try to do science fiction, to try to figure out how alien organisms can function. And usually you just have a carrot that looks like a human being. If you look at an old Irwin Allen story, they don't really think through what it means to do that, and it's very, very hard to find. At least in the old science fiction that I read in the 70s and 80s, stuff that was really biologically sophisticated. Larry Niven has done a lot of that. And I don't speak on the terms of more recent science fiction novels because I haven't really been reading up with the literature on that. You get a little tiny touch of it in Star Trek and that kind of science-based sort of stuff. But it's really difficult to imagine logical systems. You get a little bit of it with playing around with alternative vertebrate systems, like what would happen if dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct and how could they have evolved since then. They can play around with it. Dougal Dixon, I think his name, is kind of played around with a little bit of that stuff. And Life After Man dealt with a little bit of that kind of a context as well. But it's still all a thought experiment stage because it's very difficult about how many contingencies are involved. We know the diversity of life is so spectacular that it's almost like all bets are off, that if you have sufficient time and environment, who knows what little teeny bits and pieces of what we have can diverge and vestigialize and mutate off in strange little directions if you give enough time. Ooh, Crichton and the Andromeda Strain, yeah. That's actually, it's one of my favorite science fiction films. It's one of the most science-y ones of the time, and by which I'm talking about the 1970 that Robert Wise directed. It's also got a really neat all-electronic film score, which is kind of funky, but has a wonderful cast of Canadian actors largely. Was based very closely on the book. TV version was modified severely, involved time travel and a bunch of other stuff. But the interesting question was that the core organism, the Andromeda strain, was this completely non-standard life form that lived in space and got brought down in a military satellite with the options of doing it as a military weapon. And this turned out to be a really bad idea because it turns out to be not at all good for us when it escapes accidentally, when this doctor brings it home to his thing in Piedmont, Arizona, and opens the damn thing up, not operating like the lunar receiving lab. But the premise of it was that it was not based on amino acids, that it was a crystalline organism, and it basically converted energy directly into material form and could grow under radiation, which turned out to be really a dangerous property. It was a fun science fiction conception. Fiction is that the Andromeda strain is impossible. Show me one and we can see. But it made a real rip-snorting story, and it is one of my all-time favorite science fiction films. It was one I went to see in the drive-in several times. I only saw Star Wars once when it came out. Once, and I knew the movie, but I had to see Andromeda Strain again and again. It's a really neat flick for me.
Well, all right.
I suppose I should footnote, in his dotage before he died, became a climate change skeptic. Just goes to show that somebody who comes from a kind of a science-loving background can suddenly have brain farts. And too bad.
Indeed. Anyway, I'm kind of happy we didn't have any more interruptions in the stream. That was not too pleasant at the beginning there, was it? Anyway,
this book, Paranoia says, yeah, there are many things. Well, Caverites in H.G. Wells's Anti-Gravity Paint in 1890-something, but sorry, I'm afraid we have to rule that one out. I'd say the Andromeda strain is more plausible than Caverite Anti-Gravity Paint, but only barely.
All right. Well, since we've come up, subtracting the time when the stream was down, thanks to Verizon, and they're going to
we lost about 15 minutes easy on that one.
They're going to hear about it. Trust me. Why don't you tell everybody how they can help you keep doing what you're doing?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I've got a place where they can all go to find not only the content of a lot of my work, come on, typo, but also links to the books and the GoFundMe site and all of that. The Patreon is a separate. Oh yeah, the one. The novel, I'll just put a plug in on Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. That one is a mystery science fiction retelling steampunk twists of Around the World in 80 Days, and a bunch of H.G. Wells and Arthur Conan Doyle, and a bunch of historical material, and an Edgar Allan Poe detective, and a whole bunch all going on in a pile of it. I've been delighted with the reviews of it, including from Eat Meal, who gave a really nice review of it. And so far, everybody who's read the book has enjoyed it. And I think it's because it's a rip-snorting good tale. I'm about halfway through writing the sequel, Under the Southern Double Cross. If I can hang on long enough to figure that one out, I will. Evolution Slam Dunk is, of course, the killer, kick-butt mammal transition. And the fact is that I'm rather saddened that nobody had written this before me. Guns in the anti-creationism environment had ever bothered to do much on it. Robert Prothero has a little section on it, but not from the point of view of criticizing creationists. You had to go all the way back to articles in the 1980s that criticized Duane Gish a little bit years ago. So given how spectacular the reptile mammal transition data is, and how head up their ass dumb every single creationist is who thinks to bring it up, that I'm going, wait, wow, why isn't this right up front? Because you can just shred everybody in this area. Intelligent design fares very badly here. It's ironic. Young Earth creationists actually kind of sort of pretended to engage more of the science data than the intelligent designers have. And that's pretty lame when you see it. And it's a small bunch of people. Oh, yes, Edgar Allan Poe was insane. Yeah. Bear in the Book, which I read long before the movie, is quite different. I believe it's called Who Killed Roger Rabbit. Oh, yeah, the book behind that movie. They took quite a bit of liberties with it. Digression on the fact that, generally speaking, people who make films out of books have to deal with the fact that the books aren't necessarily filmic. Nobody can film Frankenstein straight because it will be the most boring movie you've ever seen in your life. It's got terrible dialogue and it's really tedious. Even in the Around the World in 80 Days case, you have to kind of riff off of the material. And then if you do something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, boy, you have to basically come up with a whole new plot. And the Disney version's much better than the book. It's a much richer, deeper storyline with serious overtones that are not in the original Verne novel. And my is riffing off of the Disney version of 20,000 Leagues. A spoiler alert, because it's on the back cover of the book. Princess Aouda is the smarter sister of Captain Nemo in my novel, and thereby hangs quite a lot of the tale. Anyway, back to Evolution Slam Dunk. The reptile mammal transition is spectacular. It's stuff that we carry around with us. We got it in our jaw, our ear. It's us, our origins. So this is a story that's really close to who we are. And the idea that this was not as widely known as bird evolution or whale evolution, as interesting as those are, it means also the reptile mammal transition doesn't suffer from a lot of the difficulties that a lot of those transitions do, where you snag up on fossil preservation issues. And the reptile mammal transition has a mammoth swath of information, plus predicted fossils and a whole bunch of stuff. So it's too good to pass up.
And all right. Oh, and Satan. Yes, Satan. All of the links to RJ's various materials, books, websites, things of that sort will all be accurately represented in the description. So fear not.
Please come, help.
All right.
You won't be sorry on the books. I can say, I'm very proud of I'm proud of all the stuff that I've written, all the material that you can download, all the PDFs, 3 macroevolutionary episodes, and all the rest. I've never felt anything other than pride of work on any of the material that I've ever done. And I think that although some of the stuff has been superseded or refined by newer material, I don't think there's any points that I've ever made in any of the material where I've had to go, yipes, I certainly went the wrong way on that one. The science that's come along subsequently has done very well. If you read the old 3 macroevolutionary episodes section on bird evolution, I already have the seeds of what eventually turned out to be the case, which was that the bird digit issue has been resolved as a frame shift and all of that. So I think I'm pretty good on keeping up with the data and not jumping past the data, always resting it on solid ground.
Alrighty. Well, take a look at the time, RJ. We have given what was promised. RJ's Evolution Hour. RJ's Evolution Hour
Oh,
was in fact an hour. Very
yeah,
nice.
Jade. Yes, that's the one with David Niven and Shirley MacLaine. Yes, the best picture of 1956. A little slow paced by modern day standards, but nonetheless, it made David Niven a star. Poor Shirley MacLaine was bored silly playing Aouda because she had nothing to do in it. My Aouda is considerably more kick butt interesting. You Only Live Twice. Most of the Bond movies have only peripheral connection to the books. They were riffing off of the titles. Goldfinger, in particular, which is my view the best of the Bond movies. It's the tightest and the neatest material. The whole main plot was invented for the movie, and in fact, there's the famous scene where Bond is explaining to Goldfinger how it's impossible for him to do what he claims he's going to do, which is to take all the gold out of Fort Knox. There's not enough time to do it. And Goldfinger's sitting over there all smug like everything. Says, who says I plan on removing the gold? Well, all of that from that point on in the movie is made up in the film version because the screenwriter, original Bond novel, said this plot can't work. And the calculations that he did about how impossible the number of trucks that they would have needed fits into the film. And so the whole bit about the atomic bomb and the Chinese and all that subplot that forms the core of the film version came about because the book version wouldn't work.
All right, that's the hour, Chief. Let us.
Okay, are we going to sit for post-hour chit-chat?
We could very well do that. Well, let's. I believe we should. All right.
John Barry taught your cousin guitar. That's absolutely fascinating. Barry is an intriguing. Film music is another area of mine, so pardon me if I'm a geek on this too. Barry is very talented and also terrible in alternating modes. It depends on the kind of work he does. If he's doing in the Bond films, Goldfinger's score is just crystal and perfect. It's just dead on fabulous. And a lot of the other films, he won an Oscar for The Lion in Winter, which is a very brooding, serious film. The spectacular performances. Katharine Hepburn won her third Oscar off of it, deservedly. So, I mean, the only tie Oscar in history with Barbara Streisand for Funny Girl. You give him another kind of area, light comedy, science fiction, and or science fiction in general, and boy, he just falls apart. John Barry's score for Howard the Duck is just leaden, and it helped bring the movie down. And his score for the Black Hole, the Disney flick, is just tedious. The fight scenes are tendentious and that. So when he had to do light pizzicato, Alan Silvestri's light stuff, like the kind of thing that's needed for Back to the Future, he just wasn't up to it. On his genre, which had a jazz element, he was came from a band background. He was really quite amazing, and so I both love and hate John Barry scores.
All right, RJ, how's it? Let us wrap this up. And if you want to, do you want to do an after show with everyone? I mean, the conversation seems to be going on.
I'm happy to
All right.
do go on if people are listening and talking.
Sure, absolutely. It's just we want to keep it because people who view it after they're looking for an hour. Let them watch an hour, so that's good.
Put in
All right.
the end stream, and then I can go on about Elmer Bernstein and the Man with the Golden Arm.
Yeah, we'll tell you. We'll run your closing sequence. Then we'll stop this stream, and I'll bring up another stream that you could just hang out, RJ. You don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah. I love these things. I love the interactions and where the conversations go.
Yeah. All right. Let's run this.
I can talk about John Williams too. That's a fascinating subject.
Yeah. Let me. I'll play your closing credits. I'll stop the stream. Everybody, stick around. I'll bring up another stream, so you don't have to go anywhere either. It'll just come back, and we'll call it RJ's Evolution Hour After Show, and the conversation can go on. So, that being the case,
Music.
let us Let us get to, here we go. RJ's closing. Take notice of the Patreon address down the bottom. Go there. All right, we'll be back in a minute with the after show.